When does a phenomenon become the unknown? When all attempts at understanding fail, and those who thirst for knowledge and understanding watch as research turns to ash in their mouth, as the phenomenon turns from a riddle to be solved into anomalous fascination. Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning in to episode 10 of the Anomalous Fascination podcast. Once again, to those of you listening, it truly means the world to have you not only tuning in each week, but also giving comments or asking questions after each episode. Oh, and to those of you listening, I'm planning on doing something a bit different starting in the new year. This podcast is centered around the unknown or unexplainable that science and researchers cannot explain. However, there are so many incredible paranormal stories out there that it would truly be a shame to not share them with you. Don't worry, nothing too over the top. So beginning in January, one episode per month will be featuring the paranormal or pseudoscience. And don't worry, I'll be sure and label them as such, so as not to mix fact and fiction. And who knows? You might just find that some of these paranormal episodes may bring more truth than you'd expect. Now, as I've mentioned in many episodes, I absolutely love receiving suggestions for new episode topics, or, at very least, for my own interest in reading them. This week, I received a couple suggestions by an acquaintance of mine named Charles, and as always, was delighted to read up on them. Now, I'm not covering either of these subjects this week. However, one of them contains something that piqued my interest. As someone who researches and sorts through hundreds of topics to determine if they are unexplainable, and if so, if that explanation is reliable, I've found that the leading theory on one of his suggestions seemed to keep popping up as, quote, the solution, end quote, to many topics I've been researching. But it never really seemed to be explained in full detail in these articles. So I decided to look into this oft-used explanation to see if it has legs. So now, on with the episode. This week, our story starts only about 45 minutes south of where I live, in the small city of Mattoon, Illinois. We begin our story on August 31st, 1944, at a residential home in Mattoon, around 3 to 4 a.m., when a man named Urban Rafe was rudely awoken by a strong stench in the air. It wasn't rank like rotting flesh, excrement, or spoiled milk, but rather a strange, strong but sweet smell. He only had a moment to contemplate the odor after being awoken in the middle of the night, when he suddenly felt nauseated, then weakness in his extremities, and seemingly without warning, he started vomiting uncontrollably. His wife, who was in the bed with him, was obviously woken as well and was concerned that perhaps a gas leak may have occurred in the home. So she decided to get up and investigate. Well, she decided that, but unfortunately was unable to accomplish that goal as she was suddenly paralyzed in various parts of her body, leaving her unable to leave the bed. That same evening, not too far from Rafe's home, a similar incident had occurred within an hour or so of their incident, as a young mother reported hearing her young daughter coughing loudly from her bedroom. When the mother attempted to get up, she found herself physically unable to get out of bed. Needless to say, these incidents were strange, but nothing too alarming. The following night of September 1st, a woman by the last name of Kearney observed the same strong, sweet odor at around 11 p.m. She dismissed it at first as her windows were open and assumed it was from her flower garden. But when the smell got stronger and Mrs. Kearney suddenly began to lose feelings in her legs, she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't the flowers. She shouted for help, and her sister came and investigated. As her sister then called the police and stated she thought someone might be outside of their window causing this. The police came right away and did not find any prowlers outside, and soon after, left the scene. About 30 minutes later, her husband finally got home from working late. When he approached the house, he noticed an unidentified man standing close to one of their windows. He pursued the man, but with no success. He was, however, able to describe the man as being a tall man, dressed in dark clothing, wearing a tight-fitting cap. This story was reported to the local paper, which reported the incident as being the first attack of a figure that would be known as the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Between August 31st and September 13th, there were around 30 reported attacks all across the town of Mattoon. The reports frequently would describe the man as the Kearneys had, and wielding what is called a flit gun, which, if you've ever seen old cartoons of people spraying pesticides, it looks just like that. The mood and energy in the town was absolutely insane. The FBI became involved, the police were issuing out orders to the people of the town regarding safety precautions, and even had to put the kibosh on civilians forming search parties and searching the city for the culprit. Because, let's face it, they were all armed, so high tension and anxiety, combined with residential neighborhoods, combined with firearms, not the best combination. Finally, the police made an announcement to the town saying it was, quote, probably something explainable made worse by public fears, and a sign of the anxiety felt by women while the men were off at war, end quote. I'd like to thank 1940s America for keeping it just sexist enough for us to remember the time period this story occurred in. After this announcement, the attacks largely subsided, leaving people to figure out what had happened. Police investigated, and without physical evidence of any kind, it was extremely hard to accept that this Mad Gasser actually even existed. As they offered up several hypotheses regarding industrial pollution being the potential cause of some or all of the attacks, though they had no way of proving that or any reason to believe that. Some suggested that perhaps there was an attacker, but only the first event reported by the papers, which they suspected could have been an attempted robbery as the family was wealthy, and that all of the remaining cases were individuals seeking attention. And, of course, the most popular hypothesis, that the entire event was caused not by an outward stimulus, but rather by the human mind and stress causing actual physical symptoms, which then were shared by many others in the area as news spread, a phenomenon known throughout history as mass hysteria. Let's take a stroll, shall we? For hundreds of years, mass hysteria has been present in societies around the world. And no, it's not Beatlemania, a huge sale at Kohl's, or even a run on the banks during the Great Depression. It's something with much more heft to it than people getting overly excited. But, as you may suspect, the term is misused and misattributed more and more each year. To start, let's lead with a definition and some optional terminology for mass hysteria. That way we'll know what we're referring to from here on out. Known as mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness, or MPI, or collective obsessional behavior, it is defined as, quote, the rapid spread of illness signs and symptoms affecting members of a cohesive group originating from a nervous system disturbance involving excitation, loss, or alteration of function, whereby physical complaints that are exhibited unconsciously have no corresponding organic etiology. Or in layman's terms, a bunch of people within a community or area begin reacting with physical signs of illness or unusual motor function, likely because their brain tells them it's real. And there are no physical explanations. So that's a basic definition, and here are a few rules surrounding what mass hysteria is. Number 1, it can't be explained by a physical disease. 2, the people affected would normally not behave in this fashion. 3, excludes situations where people are gathered and convinced or tricked by someone into experiencing the symptoms. Number 4, does not include events such as fads, crazes, or riots. And number 5, the link between those involved cannot be coincidental. Sounds crazy, right? There have been many significant occurrences of mass hysteria that meet that definition. you might be surprised to learn that they're still happening and have been for the last 20 years. Which I will get to later when we're discussing various occurrences. But before we get on to examples, some listeners might find themselves wincing slightly at the terminology mass hysteria. Not because of the reality of what it's describing, but rather the use of terminology that is fraught with negative connotations. There are a couple of reasons why. First, over the centuries there have been many sexist and unsubstantiated claims that were held for a very long time of intellectually deficient people and women as being the most likely to experience mass hysteria. Most people, myself included, see this as not only problematic, but completely unsupported by any documentation. And for those of you who have been grimacing at the use of the word hysteria, you're not alone. And that's the second part. The word hysteria has a pretty rough origin in history. The word hysteria being derived from the Greek word for uterus, thus explaining why the illness of hysteria, not mass hysteria, was a condition specifically designated for women throughout history. Now, for those unfamiliar with hysteria, women for centuries have been declared, quote, hysterical by priests and medical doctors, and typically receive terrible punishments or were even sentenced to mental institutions for, quote, hysteria. Which you must be thinking, goodness, this hysteria must be pretty serious for all that. Well, hysteria essentially has no exact definition, as it was used to describe, quote, symptoms in women, ranging from having a fondness for writing, being depressed, speaking their minds too often, or even simply for being infertile. Basically, if it was something men found unpleasant, it could be called hysteria. So needless to say, the usage of the term hysteria brings an understandable amount of baggage along with it. Due to not only the negative connotations surrounding hysteria, the aforementioned misuse of mass hysteria to describe even the slightest outburst of emotion by a group, the term mass hysteria was retired by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. At which point, the scientific community would more frequently refer to it by the other names I provided earlier, such as mass psychogenic illness or collective obsessional behavior. So we've got some definitions and some misconceptions out of the way, and we've even discussed one such incidence of mass hysteria in the 1940s. Of course, this was a very wild and unbelievable story, but surprisingly, most of the incidences throughout history were equally, if not more, shocking. As discussed in the intro, the idea for this episode was gathered from a suggested topic from a listener. But the problem is, this example plus a couple others are so unbelievable and rich in information that I've elected to not include them in this episode, as they may be covered in episodes further down the road. So if you know some of the more famous cases that I may skip, just know that it was intentional. As I was researching various incidences throughout history, I had to continuously skip subject after subject and narrow it down to the most interesting and unusual subjects. And even then, I wrote down far too many and had to cut more. So I'll do my best to describe these incidences as briefly as possible. Number 1. The writing tremor epidemics, 1892 and 1904. In 1892, a 10-year-old girl in a local school suddenly began having tremors in her writing hand, which gradually worked their way up and throughout her entire body, giving her body seizures that, within minutes, spread to more and more students, affecting 19 additional students. Within days, a similar incident in Switzerland occurred, striking once again, in which, again, 20 students were affected. 12 years later, the school in Switzerland experienced the exact same situation, this time affecting 27 students. After considerable research in both 1892 and 1904, no explanation could be found except mass hysteria. Number 2. The Anganyika laughter epidemic, 1962. Beginning on January 30th, 1962, at a mission-run boarding school for girls in Tanzania. 3 girls in the school began laughing. Quietly at first, but then uncontrollably. Teachers and other students were perplexed and tried to get them to stop, but they couldn't. Soon, others in the school began laughing as well, until 95 out of 159 students in the school were all laughing uncontrollably. The school was forced to close, and the students were sent home to the nearby village that was home to many of the girls. Although their initial symptoms lasted anywhere from a few hours to 16 days, within a couple months after this incident, 217 people in that village had been infected with the laughing attacks. Schools remained closed as the laughing attacks seemed to spread to schools in nearby towns, finally ending many months after the attack. After research and investigation for quite some time, no biological or alternative explanation could be found. So this was cited as once again being caused by mass hysteria. The June bug epidemic of 1962. A mysterious disease broke out in a portion of the U.S. textile factory, causing numbness, nausea, dizziness, and vomiting. Word began to spread throughout the building of a bug that would bite its victims, giving them the illness. 62 employees in all were affected, many of them hospitalized. After heavy investigation due to public health concerns, no answers could be found as the individuals showed no illness or signs of anything biological in their system. And most importantly, none of them showed any bug bites. Once again, mass hysteria was assigned as the culprit. 1999. Coca-Cola was forced to withdraw 30 million units of its product from Belgium and northern France, after over 100 people complained of cramps, nausea, and complications after consuming the beverage. Testing by both Coca-Cola and various independent agencies found no evidence of a tainted product. Again, mass hysteria. I will note, though, when large businesses are involved, they are pretty efficient at making problems disappear. So, who knows? And lastly, the 2016 clown sightings. Yes, that's right. Clowns. Some of you may recall that during that time, there were sightings of people in evil clown costumes all across the US, Canada, and 18 other countries. This one is a bit more unusual because the version of mass hysteria is suggesting not that the people made it up, but that their symptoms from mass hysteria involved actually seeing these clowns that were not there, likely due to a combination of people's intense fear of clowns and social media spreading this fear to others affected. In fact, there would be many other stories to come after that where social media began playing a part in these instances. Hopefully by this point you now understand a bit about mass hysteria and why I decided to discuss this matter this week. But the question I and many others have asked regarding mass hysteria is this: is this a chicken and egg situation? Sure, I've given plenty of examples of the occurrences of mass hysteria, so what do I mean by chicken and egg situation? Stay tuned after this short break to find out. So, which came first? Mass hysteria? Or the events it's used to describe? Seems like an odd question, right? The obvious answer would be, of course mass hysteria came first, it's what caused these events. Well, did it? As someone who researches the unexplainable and the unknown every week, I always find the explanation of "it was mass hysteria" extremely unsatisfying. Thus, I typically tend to look at unexplainable occurrences that have been quote-unquote solved by saying the words mass hysteria as almost on par with those who cry out aliens. Sure, more studied and learned people have been the ones to typically declare something as mass hysteria, but what is mass hysteria but a description of the events it's been linked to? This may be confusing, because, of course, many terms and diagnoses are only discovered after witnessing their symptoms. But mass hysteria is different. Let me explain. First off, despite being described as a psychogenic illness, you will not find it anywhere in the DSM-5, including any of its contemporary names. And in the DSM-4, you'll find conversion disorder, which is more of a singular version of mass hysteria, affecting only one person, but nothing about mass hysteria or its alternative names. So while it is a phenomena that many in the health field will use to describe certain events, they don't list it as an actual mental disorder. Additionally, though it is difficult to research most mental disorders, most all are able to have experiments done by researchers in the field. Not the case with mass hysteria, as researchers are unable to do research on these phenomena. Given that part of the 5 rules for mass hysteria states that they cannot be created unnaturally via suggestion or manipulation, there is no way for anyone to perform controlled studies on completely random and unpredictable phenomena. Many experts in the field who find trouble accepting the legitimacy of mass hysteria state that most research that is performed is people reviewing the facts of what happened, determining everything that it isn't, figuring out if there's any possible long-shot theories that are unprovable, and when no other explanation is possible, they throw a mass hysteria sticker on it and continue on. Not only trying to shut the door on future investigations into the matter by declaring it quote-unquote solved, but even prevents others during the active investigation to consider if there were any biological or alternative factors they may have missed. So, sometimes I let my biases show. Guilty. As I'll openly admit, I strongly dislike the term mass hysteria to describe unexplainable and unsolved events. It's as if leaving something as unexplainable is admitting failure. It feels to me that the term mass hysteria was just one person calling an event mass hysteria, and then every other time something unexplainable happened, they said, yeah, it's kind of like that other thing, and slapped the mass hysteria sticker on that too, eventually becoming so commonly used that it became accepted as reality. Although mass hysteria is used to describe some uncontrollable inner parts of your brain that unwillingly make you feel or act certain ways, I can't imagine surviving an event like the ones described today, and after a few days of investigation being told, don't worry, it was all in your head. Who does mass hysteria help? Does anyone find comfort in that knowledge when an event has passed? It seems to me that in these situations, having someone say, I don't know how this happened, this is crazy, might not heal any wounds, but it certainly won't open any new ones. So whether your great-grandma was attacked by a man with a gas canister, industrial fumes, or mass hysteria, she can believe whatever she wants. Because in the end, no matter how professional it may sound, we're all just guessing. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Anomalous Fascination. If you'd like to keep in touch with the show, you could find me at AnomalyPod on Twitter, or email me at anomalousfascination@gmail.com. And if you love the show, hop on Apple Podcasts and leave a nice 5-star rating and review. Or even just tell a friend about it. And until next time, thanks for listening.